The Grand Royal Hotel sparkled under crystal chandeliers, with marble floors reflecting the elegant footsteps of guests. Men in tuxedos clinked champagne glasses, while women in designer dresses laughed in hushed conversations. At the center of VT, the ballroom under the spotlight, Hayter Albuquerque, one of the country's most influential businessmen, stood tall on the stage. "Today we celebrate a new milestone in the history of Albuquerque Group," Hayter announced with perfect posture. And a calculated smile. Applause echoed throughout the room. Cameras captured every second. Hayter was the perfect symbol of absolute success, but then a scream cut through the luxurious night. "Dad, you forgot me." The ballroom fell silent. Everyone turned toward the sound. A boy, dirty, with torn clothes and bare feet, had somehow made it past security. His hair was disheveled and his wide eyes mixed anger and desperation. He was trembling, but his voice carried the weight of years of pain. Hayter froze, the color drained from his face. "It's me, Dad." "You abandoned me for money," guests began to whisper. Some women covered their mouths in shock. The press, attentive to every detail, raised their phones to capture the moment. The billionaire tried to compose himself. "Security," he ordered, his voice colder than he intended. But before the men could act, the boy stepped forward. "Look at me," his voice cracked. "I'm your son. You promised you'd come back." Those words hit Hayter like a knife. He remembered Pedro, the son he had left behind 8 years ago when he traded a simple life for his limitless ambition. He had sworn he would return, but he never did. Because it was easier to forget than to face the guilt. And now, faced with the accusing gaze of his own blood, everything he had built seemed meaningless. Rita Mendonça, Hayter's current fiancée, stood frozen at the side of the stage. Her perfect makeup couldn't hide her shock as she stared at the boy, then at Hayter, searching for denial in his eyes but finding only shame. "What is this child talking about, Hayter?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but in the silent room everyone heard. Carlos Albuquerque, Hayter's brother and business partner, quickly approached security. "Get that kid out of here," he ordered. "He's clearly confused or looking for money." But the security guards hesitated, looking at Hayter for confirmation. They had never seen their boss so shaken. Pedro didn't want money, luxury, or empty excuses. He just wanted to know why. Why was he abandoned? Why wasn't he enough? The billionaire closed his eyes, feeling the weight of what he had done. And then, in front of everyone, he stepped down from the stage. Absolute silence. Hayter knelt in front of the boy. His voice, choked with emotion, escaped in a whisper. "Forgive me, son." Pedro's contained tears exploded, and in that ballroom where wealth defined everything, the embrace of a father and son was the most valuable thing anyone could witness. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the large windows of Hayter's penthouse. Pedro sat awkwardly on the edge of a leather sofa that probably cost more than everything his mother had owned. He looked around at the modern art on the walls, the crystal decorations, the view of the city below. It was all so different from the tiny apartment where he had grown up. "Are you hungry?" Hayter asked, still unsure how to act around his son. Pedro nodded silently. Rita entered the living room, her high heels clicking on the marble floor. She had tried to smile at the boy, but there was tension in her eyes. "I've asked Donna Celeste to prepare breakfast," she said, referring to the housekeeper. "What do you like to eat, Pedro?" "Anything," the boy mumbled, not looking at her. Carlos burst into the apartment without knocking, his face red with anger. "Have you lost your mind, Hayter? The press is going crazy. Our stock dropped 5 points this morning." "Lower your voice," Hayter warned, glancing at Pedro. "We need to handle this situation immediately," Carlos continued, ignoring his brother's warning. "I've already contacted our PR team. We'll say the kid is confused or that his mother put him up to this for money." Pedro jumped to his feet. "My mother never wanted your money. She got sick waiting for you to come back." Hayter's heart sank. "What do you mean, got sick?" Pedro's eyes filled with tears again. "She died last month. Cancer. That's why I came looking for you. I have nowhere else to go." The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Heitor stumbled backward, collapsing onto a chair. Maria, his first love, the woman he had promised to return to someday, was gone, and their son had been left alone. "You can't seriously be thinking of keeping him here," Carlos whispered harshly to Heitor. "We have the merger with Santiago Industries next week. This scandal could ruin everything we've worked for." Rita approached Heitor, placing a manicured hand on his shoulder. "Your brother is right, darling. We need to think about this carefully. Perhaps there's a boarding school or—" "No," Heitor interrupted, his voice firm for the first time since seeing Pedro. "He stays with me. He's my son." Carlos threw his hands up in frustration. "And what about our empire? What about your engagement? You can't just—" "I said he stays," Heitor repeated, standing up. Something had changed in his eyes. A resolve, a clarity that hadn't been there before. In the kitchen, Donna Celeste, who had worked for Heitor for years, prepared breakfast while listening to everything. Unlike the others, she smiled softly to herself. Perhaps this boy was exactly what her boss needed to remember the man he once was. That afternoon, Heitor took Pedro shopping for new clothes. The boy was reluctant at first, but slowly began to relax as Heitor shared stories about when he was young and had dreams beyond money. "Your mother and I met at university," Heitor said as they walked through the mall. "I was studying business and she was studying literature. She always believed I would change the world. She talked about you sometimes," Pedro admitted. "She kept your picture by her bed even after all those years." Heitor felt a stab of guilt so sharp it took his breath away. As they were leaving the mall, they ran into Gabriela Santiago, the daughter of Heitor's biggest business rival and potential merger partner. She was a beautiful young woman with kind eyes, nothing like her ruthless father. "Heitor," she greeted him with surprise. "I didn't expect to see you here." Her eyes moved curiously to Pedro. "Gabriela, this is Pedro, my son," Heitor said, the word still strange on his tongue. Her eyes widened slightly, but unlike others, she smiled warmly at the boy. "It's very nice to meet you, Pedro." The boy mumbled a greeting, but Heitor noticed how his son's gaze lingered on Gabriela. "I hope this doesn't affect our family's plans," she said quietly to Heitor. "Business is business," Heitor replied, though he wasn't entirely sure anymore. Everything was changing so quickly. Back at the penthouse, they found Rita hosting an emergency meeting with the company's PR team and lawyers. She looked alarmed when she saw them enter. "Heitor, we need to discuss how to handle this situation." "Publicly," one of the lawyers began. "There's nothing to handle," Heitor interrupted. "Pedro is my son. I'm acknowledging him publicly and privately. But the Santiago merger," another advisor started, "will proceed as planned if they're truly interested in our company's value, and not just my personal life," Heitor finished firmly. Rita pulled Heitor aside, her perfect smile strained. "Darling, you know I support you, but this is happening so fast. Our wedding is in 3 months. We need to think about how Pedro fits into our lives." Heitor looked at his fiancée, beautiful, polished, ambitious Rita, and for the first time, he wondered if she loved him or the life he provided. "He doesn't need to fit into our lives, Rita. We need to build a new life that includes him." Later that night, after everyone had left and Pedro had gone to bed in the guest room, Heitor sat alone on his balcony, staring at the city lights. He took out his phone and found an old photo of Maria that he had kept hidden all these years. Her smile, so genuine and loving, made his heart ache. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the image. "I'll take care of our son now, I promise." Inside the penthouse, unknown to Heitor, Pedro wasn't asleep. He was exploring his new surroundings, taking in the life his father had built without him. In a home office, he found documents about the Santiago merger, papers that mentioned a risk assessment of Heitor's personal life. There was a note in someone's handwriting: "Handle the boy's situation before the Santiagos back out." Pedro felt his heart harden. He may have found his father, but he was still an outsider here, a problem to be handled. He wondered if coming had been a mistake after all. But down the hall, in the kitchen, Donna Celeste was preparing a special breakfast for the morning, humming to herself. "That boy has his mother's eyes," she told her cat, "and his father's stubborn chin. He belongs here, no matter what the others say." The night deepened over the city. In one building, Carlos made furious phone calls, trying to salvage what he saw as a disaster. In another, Gabriela Santiago thought about the sad-eyed boy she had met and wondered about his story. And in Heitor's penthouse, father and son slept under the same roof for the first time in 8 years, both unaware that their reunion was about to shake the foundations of an empire and change the lives of everyone around them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight at least Pedro had found his father, and Heitor had been given a second chance he never thought he'd have, a chance to remember who he was before power and money had twisted his heart. The morning sun streamed through the blinds of the guest bedroom where Pedro had spent his first night in his father's penthouse. He opened his eyes slowly, momentarily confused by the softness of the mattress and the silky sheets, so different from the worn-out bed he had shared with his mother in their tiny apartment. Reality came rushing back. His mother was gone. He was living with a father who had abandoned him, and everyone around him seemed to view him as a problem to be solved. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Donna Celeste, the housekeeper, peeked inside with a warm smile. "Good morning, young man. I've made breakfast. Your father is waiting for you in the dining room." Pedro got dressed in one of the new outfits Heitor had bought him yesterday. The clothes felt strange, too perfect, too expensive. When he entered the dining room, he found Heitor sitting alone at a massive table, reading financial reports on his tablet. "There you are," Heitor said, looking up. His smile seemed genuine but uncertain. "Did you sleep well?" Pedro shrugged. "The bed was nice?" An awkward silence followed as Donna Celeste served them pancakes, fresh fruit, and juice. Heitor cleared his throat. "I have to go to the office today. There's a board meeting I can't miss." He hesitated. "Would you like to come with me? See where I work?" Before Pedro could answer, the elevator to the penthouse dinged, and Rita walked in. She was dressed immaculately in a designer suit, her makeup flawless. "Good morning," she said with a tight smile. She barely glanced at Pedro before turning to Heitor. "Darling, we need to talk about the press statement. Carlos has been calling non-stop." Heitor's expression hardened. "I already told him my decision. Pedro is my son and I'm not hiding him." Rita sighed, taking a seat at the table. "No one is suggesting hiding him, but we need to control the narrative. The press is speculating wildly. There are already rumors that you had a secret family all these years." "I didn't have a secret family," Heitor replied, his voice rising slightly. "I had a son I abandoned. That's the truth." Pedro stared at his pancakes, wishing he could disappear. This wasn't how he had imagined finding his father would be. In his dreams, they had simply been happy to be reunited. There had been no board meetings, press statements, or tense conversations with fiancés. "I don't want to go to your office," Pedro said suddenly. "I don't want to be in your press statement either." Heitor looked at his son, surprised. "Pedro, I'm trying to do the right thing here." "Now? After 8 years?" The words came out sharper than Pedro intended. "My mom died waiting for you to come back. You don't get to decide to be my dad just when it's convenient." Silence fell over the table. Donna Celeste, who had been lingering in the doorway, quietly retreated to the kitchen. Rita took advantage of the moment. "Perhaps Pedro could spend the day with my sister, Laura. She's a teacher, good with children. It would give you time to handle the business matters, and Pedro wouldn't have to face the press." Heitor looked torn. "What do you think, Pedro? Just for today." Pedro wanted to refuse, to say he didn't need a babysitter, but the truth was, he didn't want to spend the day watching his father try to fit him into his perfect life. "Whatever," he mumbled. 2 hours later, Pedro found himself in a modest apartment on the other side of the city. Laura Garcia was nothing like her sister Rita. Where Rita was polished and formal, Laura was casual and warm. Her apartment was filled with books, plants, and colorful artwork. "So, you're Heitor Albuquerque's son," Laura said, offering him a cookie. "That must be pretty overwhelming." Pedro took the cookie but didn't respond. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to," Laura continued, settling into a chair across from him. "But just so you know, I'm not really here to babysit you. Rita just wanted you out of the way while they handle their PR crisis." That got Pedro's attention. "You don't like your sister very much, do you?" Laura laughed. I love my sister. I just don't approve of everything she does. She studied Pedro's face. You have your father's eyes. That's what my mom always said, Pedro replied quietly, feeling a pang in his chest. Tell me about her, Laura suggested gently. And to his own surprise, Pedro did. He told Laura about his mother, how she had loved books and taught literature at the local school, how she had never said a bad word about Heitor despite being abandoned, how she had fought her illness until the very end. She sounds like an amazing woman, Laura said when he finished. Much better than my sister deserves to replace. Pedro looked at her sharply. What do you mean? Laura seemed to realize she had said too much. Nothing. Forget I said anything. But Pedro wouldn't. Let it go. You don't think Rita really loves my dad, do you? Laura sighed. It's complicated, Pedro. Your father is a powerful man. Many people want things from him. Before Pedro could press further, his phone rang. It was Heitor checking in. The conversation was brief and strained. Heitor promised to pick him up after the board meeting. After hanging up, Pedro found Laura watching him with sympathy. It's not easy, is it? Finding out your parent isn't who you thought they were. I don't know what I thought, Pedro admitted. I just knew I had nowhere else to go. Laura reached over and squeezed his hand. Maybe this is where you were meant to be all along. At Albuquerque Tower, Heitor sat at the head of a long conference table surrounded by board members and executives. His brother Carlos was pacing near the windows, unable to hide his agitation. The Santiago merger is the biggest deal we've ever pursued, Carlos was saying. Their conditions were clear. No scandals, no surprises, and now this? This is my son, Heitor said firmly. And if Santiago Industries can't accept that I have a child, perhaps we shouldn't be doing business with them at all. Several board members exchanged worried glances. That's easy for you to say, Carlos shot back. You've already made your fortune. Some of us still have something to prove. The room fell silent at the bitter comment. The tension between the brothers had always been there, bubbling beneath the surface, but Pedro's arrival had brought it into the open. I've drafted a simple statement, the PR director interrupted, trying to defuse the situation. It acknowledges that Pedro is your son from a previous relationship, expresses your joy at being reunited, and asks for privacy during this family adjustment period. Heitor nodded his approval. Send it out this afternoon. The meeting was about to adjourn when Victor Santiago himself walked into the room unannounced. The elderly patriarch of Santiago Industries carried himself with the authority of a man used to getting his way. His daughter Gabriela followed behind him, looking uncomfortable. Albuquerque, Santiago said, addressing Heitor with a cold nod. I thought we should discuss this situation in person. Heitor stood, extending his hand. Victor, I wasn't expecting you. Santiago ignored the outstretched hand. Clearly, there are many things you weren't expecting, including the boy who disrupted. Your event last night, my son, Heitor corrected firmly. And yes, his arrival was unexpected, but he's here now and he's part of my life. A son you abandoned, Santiago noted. Not exactly the family values our companies advertise, is it? Carlos stepped forward. Mr. Santiago, I can assure you that this situation will be handled discreetly. I don't want discretion, Heitor interrupted. I want to make things right with my son. Santiago studied him for a long moment. Our deal required transparency. Albuquerque, you failed to mention this to complication. I didn't know Pedro would find me, Heitor replied honestly. But now that he has, I won't turn my back on him again. Even if it costs you the merger, Santiago challenged. The room held its breath. This deal was worth billions, the culmination of years of work. To everyone's surprise, it was Gabriela who broke the silence. Father, this isn't fair. Mr. Albuquerque is trying to do the right thing by his child. Santiago looked at his daughter sharply. Business isn't about doing the right thing, Gabriela. It's about reliability, predictability, and family, she countered. Isn't that what you always taught me? That family comes first. A tense silence followed as father and daughter faced off. Finally, Santiago turned back to Heitor. You have 1 week to convince me that this family reunion won't affect our business dealings. 1 week, Albuquerque. With that, he turned and left the room. Gabriela following after giving Heitor an apologetic smile. The moment the door closed, Carlos exploded. "Are you happy now? 8 years without a thought for that kid, and suddenly you're willing to risk everything for him?" "Watch yourself, Carlos," Heitor warned, his voice dangerously low. "Why, because you suddenly remembered you have a conscience?" Carlos laughed bitterly. "Or is it because Maria died and now you feel guilty?" Heitor moved so quickly that no one saw it coming. His fist connected with his brother's jaw, sending Carlos stumbling backward. Gasps filled the room as executives scrambled to separate the brothers. "Don't you ever mention her name again," Heitor hissed, straightening his suit. Meeting adjourned. When Heitor arrived at Laura's apartment to pick up Pedro, he was still shaken from the confrontation with his brother. He had never lost control like that in a business setting before. Something was changing inside him, something he couldn't quite understand. He was surprised to find Pedro and Laura laughing over a board game, looking completely at ease with each other. "You're early," Laura remarked, her smile fading slightly when she saw the tension in Heitor's face. "Is everything okay?" "Fine," Heitor replied curtly. "Pedro, are you ready to go?" Pedro looked between the adults, sensing something was wrong. "I guess." On the drive back to the penthouse, Pedro broke the uncomfortable silence. "Laura's nice, not like Rita." Heitor glanced at his son. "They're very different people." "Laura said Rita doesn't really love you," Pedro continued bluntly. "She said people want things from you because you're powerful." Heitor gripped the steering. "Wheel tighter." "Laura shouldn't be discussing my relationship with you." "Why not? It affects me too, doesn't it?" Pedro challenged. "If you marry Rita, she'll be my stepmom." The thought clearly hadn't occurred to Heitor before. He fell silent, considering the implications. When they arrived at the penthouse, they found Rita hosting a dinner with several prominent society figures. She looked surprised to see them return early. "Heitor, Pedro, I wasn't expecting you until later." She quickly composed herself, gesturing to her guests. "We were just discussing the charity gala next month." Pedro noticed how the guests stared at him with barely concealed curiosity. He heard whispers, saw the way they leaned toward each other behind manicured hands. He was a spectacle to them, the abandoned son who had returned to complicate the perfect life of Heitor Albuquerque. "I'm going to my room," he announced, not waiting for a response. In the guest bedroom that wasn't really his, Pedro pulled out his phone and looked at the last photo he had taken with his mother. She was already sick then, thin and pale, but still smiling. "I don't belong here, Mum," he whispered to the image. "These people aren't like us." A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. To his surprise, it wasn't Heitor or Donna Celeste, but Gabriela Santiago. She stood in the doorway, looking uncertain. "Your father said I could come say hello," she explained. "I was at the dinner when you came in." Pedro quickly wiped his eyes. "Why would you want to say hello to me?" Gabriela entered the room, sitting beside him on the bed. "Because I know what it's like to feel out of place in your own family." Something in her voice made Pedro believe her. "Your dad seemed pretty angry at the board meeting today," he said, repeating what he had overheard Heitor telling Rita. Gabriela nodded. "He's worried about the merger, but I think there are more important things than business deals, don't you?" Pedro shrugged. "I don't know much about business." "Neither do I, really," Gabriela admitted. "At least not the way they want me to." She glanced at the photo on Pedro's phone. "Is that your mother?" Pedro nodded, surprised when his vision blurred with tears. "She died last month." Gabriela's hand found his, warm and comforting. "I lost my mother too when I was 9. It gets easier, but it never stops hurting completely." They sat in silence for a moment, two strangers connected by loss. "Why are you being nice to me?" Pedro finally asked. "Everyone else treats me like I'm ruining everything," Gabriela smiled sadly. "Maybe because I know what it's like to be seen as an obstacle to someone else's plans." Before Pedro could ask what she meant, voices raised in argument drifted from the living room. Heitor and Rita were fighting, their carefully constructed facade cracking under the strain of Pedro's arrival. "You promised me you had no secrets," Rita's voice carried down the hallway. "Now I look like a fool in front of everyone." "I never lied to you," Heitor responded. "I told you I had a past." A past is an ex-girlfriend, Heitor, not a child you abandoned. Gabriela looked uncomfortable. I should go. As she stood to leave, Pedro grabbed her hand impulsively. Will I see you again? Something in her expression softened. I hope so, Pedro, I really do. After she left, Pedro sat alone in the darkening room, listening to the continuing argument. His presence had unraveled something here, exposed truths that had been carefully hidden beneath wealth and ambition. He thought about running away, finding somewhere else to go. But where? His mother's apartment had already been rented to someone new. All their possessions had been sold to pay for her. Medical bills, and despite everything, a small part of him wanted to stay, wanted to know the father who had left him behind, wanted to understand why money and power had been more important than love. Outside his window, the city lights blinked on one by one, creating a tapestry of artificial stars. Somewhere in that vast urban landscape was the small cemetery where his mother had been buried, and somewhere, too, were answers to questions he had carried his entire life. Pedro fell asleep with his mother's photo clutched to his chest, unaware that down the hall, Heitor was staring at his own copy of the same woman's picture, wondering how he could have gotten everything so wrong. A week had passed since Pedro's dramatic entrance into Heitor's life. The initial shock had settled into an uneasy routine. Each morning they would share a quiet breakfast, their conversations stilted and careful. Heitor would go to work, and Pedro would spend his days exploring the penthouse or sitting with Donna. Celeste in the kitchen, listening to her stories about a time before Heitor became rich and powerful. Your father wasn't always like this, she told Pedro as she kneaded dough for bread. When I first started working for him, he lived in a small apartment. He worked day and night, but he smiled more then. Pedro picked at a grape from the fruit bowl. Did you know my mom? Donna Celeste paused, her flour-covered hands hovering over the dough. Maria? Yes. I met her a few times. She was beautiful, not like these women with too much makeup and designer clothes. She had a real smile. She glanced at Pedro. Like yours, when you forget to be angry. Pedro looked away, uncomfortable with how easily the housekeeper seemed to read him. The doorbell rang and Donna Celeste wiped her hands on her apron. That must be Miss Laura. She said she might stop by today. Sure enough, Laura Garcia breezed into the kitchen moments later, bringing with her an energy that had been missing in the somber penthouse. There's my favorite student, she said, ruffling Pedro's hair. Over the past week, she had been helping him catch up on the schoolwork he had missed after his mother's death. I'm not your student, Pedro protested, but he was smiling. Laura set a stack of books on the table. It's not officially, but we can fix that. I spoke with the principal at my school. There's a spot for you in the fall semester if you want it. Pedro stared at her, surprised. You did that for me? Of course, Laura replied as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Education waits for no one, not even billionaires' sons with complicated family drama. For the first time in days, Pedro laughed. Donna Celeste exchanged a grateful look with Laura over the boy's head. Their study session was interrupted when Rita arrived, her arms laden with shopping bags. Her expression soured when she saw her sister. Laura, I didn't know you were coming today. I didn't realize I needed an appointment to see my nephew, Laura replied coolly. Pedro looked up at that word nephew. No one had defined his relationship to Rita yet, and hearing Laura claim him as family gave him an unexpected feeling of belonging. Rita's lips thinned. Pedro is not your nephew. Heitor and I aren't married yet. Yet being the operative word, Laura muttered under her breath. Rita ignored the comment, turning her attention to Pedro. I've brought you some things for the charity gala tomorrow night. All the important families will be there, and we need to make sure you look the part. Pedro glanced at the expensive boutique bags. I'm not going to any gala. Rita's carefully maintained composure slipped. This isn't optional, Pedro. Your father has specifically requested your presence. The Santiagos will be there, and after that scene at the board meeting last week, we need to present a united front. Laura stood, placing a protective hand on Pedro's shoulder. He's a 13-year-old boy who just lost his mother, Rita, not a prop for your public relations strategy. The sisters glared at each other, the tension between them palpable. "Stay out of this, Laura," Rita warned. "You have no idea what's at stake." "Don't I?" Laura challenged. "The merger? Your position as the future Mrs. Albuquerque? Or is it the access to Heitor's fortune that you're worried about?" Rita stepped closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Be careful, little sister. Remember who pays for Mum's nursing home?" Laura flinched as if she'd been slapped. Without another word, Rita swept out of the kitchen, leaving the shopping bags behind. Pedro looked at Laura, who seemed suddenly tired. "What was that about your mum?" Laura sighed, sinking back into her chair. "Our mother has Alzheimer's. She's in an expensive care facility that Rita pays for. It's her favorite way to keep me in line." Pedro's anger flared on Laura's behalf. "That's terrible." "That's Rita," Laura replied simply. "She's always known how to get what she wants." She forced a smile. "Now, let's get back to these equations before your father comes home and wonders why you haven't learned anything today." But Pedro found it hard to concentrate after that exchange. He kept thinking about Rita's threat and the way Laura had called him her nephew. For the first time since arriving at the penthouse, he felt like someone might actually want him there, across town. Heitor sat in his office, staring at a contract draft but not really seeing it. His mind was on Pedro, on the guarded way his son looked at him, on the distance he couldn't seem to bridge no matter how hard he tried. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. Gabriela Santiago entered, carrying a portfolio, the revised terms your team requested, she said, placing the folder on his desk. "My father has agreed to most of them, but he's still insisting on the morality clause." Heitor frowned. The morality clause was Victor Santiago's way of maintaining control, a provision that would allow him to pull out of the merger if any scandal damaged the Albuquerque name. "He's using my son against me," Heitor said flatly. Gabriela didn't deny it. "My father sees weaknesses to exploit. It's how he's always done business." She hesitated. How is Pedro adjusting? The question caught Heitor off guard. Most people asked about the merger, about the press reaction, about his engagement to Rita. No one asked about Pedro as a person. "He's struggling," Heitor admitted. "We both are. I don't know how to be a father. Maybe start by just being a person," Gabriela suggested gently. "Pedro doesn't need a CEO or a billionaire. He needs someone who cares about what he cares about." Heitor looked at her curiously. "You seem to understand him better than I do." A soft smile played at Gabriela's lips. "We've talked a few times. He comes to the office with Laura sometimes. They wait for you in the lobby." The revelation that his son had been in the building without his knowledge stung. "I didn't know." "You're busy," Gabriela said diplomatically, "but perhaps not always with the things that matter most." The words hung in the air between them, a truth Heitor wasn't ready to fully face. The door burst open, and Carlos strode in without knocking. He stopped short when he saw Gabriela. "Mrs. Santiago, I didn't realize you were here." His tone was formal, but his eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Just delivering the revised terms," Gabriela explained, moving toward the door. "I should go. My father is expecting me." She paused beside Heitor's desk. "Think about what I said about Pedro." After she left, Carlos turned to his brother. "What was that about?" "Nothing that concerns you," Heitor replied, his tone making it clear the subject was closed. Carlos sat heavily in the chair across from Heitor's desk. The bruise from their fight had faded, but the tension between them remained. "The gala tomorrow is our last chance to convince Santiago this merger should go forward," Carlos said. "Rita has everything arranged, the press, the key investors, the perfect photo opportunities. We need you and Pedro there, looking like the happy family everyone wants to believe you are." Heitor felt a flare of annoyance. "Is that what this is about now? Appearances?" "It's always been about appearances," Carlos shot back. "The difference is you used to understand that." Heitor stared at his brother, suddenly seeing him with new clarity. "What happened to us, Carlos? When did money become more important than everything else?" Carlos laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "That's rich coming from you. You're the one who left everything behind, including your son and his mother, to build this empire." The reminder hit Heitor like a physical blow. "And it was the biggest mistake of my life." Carlos leaned forward, his expression deadly serious. Well, don't make another one by throwing it all away now. You owe me this merger. I don't owe you anything, Heitor replied coldly. Don't you? Carlos challenged. Who covered for you all? These years? Who handled the press when rumors about your past surfaced? Who kept Maria and that boy from becoming a scandal that would have ruined everything? Heitor froze. What are you talking about? A look of satisfaction crossed Carlos's face. You didn't think she never tried to contact you, did you? All those years, not a single message got through. How convenient. The implication hung in the air like poison. Heitor felt the blood drain from his face. You intercepted her messages? You knew about my son and kept it from me? Carlos didn't deny it. I did what was necessary. We were building something important, and you were too sentimental. You would have thrown it all away if you knew she was sick, if you knew the boy needed you. Heitor moved before he realized what he was doing. He grabbed Carlos by the collar, slamming him against the wall. She died alone because of you. My son grew up thinking I didn't care because of you. Security guards burst into the office, pulling Heitor away from his brother. Carlos straightened his suit, his expression cold. You can hate me if you want, but I'm not the villain here. You chose this life, Heitor. You chose money over them. I just helped you maintain that choice. He walked to the door, pausing before he left. The gala starts at 8. Be there with your son or this company will become the biggest corporate failure in history. After Carlos left, Heitor dismissed the security guards and sat alone in his office, shaking with rage and grief. All these years, Maria had tried to reach him. She had wanted him to know she was sick, wanted Pedro to have his father. And Carlos had made sure those messages never reached him. But even as he blamed his brother, a more painful truth burned inside him. Carlos was right about one thing. Heitor had made the choice to leave. He had prioritized his ambition over the woman he loved and the child they had created together. Carlos had simply helped him avoid facing the consequences of that choice. Now those consequences had found him anyway, and he had no idea how to make things right. The night of the charity gala arrived with all the fanfare of a major society event. The Albuquerque Foundation's annual fundraiser was the highlight of the social calendar, bringing together the city's wealthiest and most influential families. In the penthouse, Pedro stood uncomfortably in front of a mirror, wearing a tailored suit that probably cost more than everything his mother had owned. Donna Celeste fussed over him, adjusting his tie. "You look so handsome," she told him, her eyes misty. "Just like your father, at your age." Pedro frowned at his reflection. "I don't want to look like him." Donna Celeste sighed. "Your father isn't a bad man, Pedro. He's just lost his way." She straightened his collar. "Sometimes people need help finding their way back to who they really are." Pedro thought about that as Heitor entered the room. His father looked tired, with dark circles under his eyes and a tension in his jaw that hadn't been there at breakfast. "You look great, son," Heitor said, his voice oddly strained. "Is something wrong?" Pedro asked, surprising himself with the question. He hadn't shown much concern for Heitor's feelings before. For a moment, it seemed like Heitor might actually answer. "Honestly?" Then Rita appeared in the doorway, resplendent in a designer gown and diamonds. "We need to leave now if we want to arrive at the right time for the photographers," she announced, assessing Pedro with a critical eye. "He'll do. Let's go." In the elevator down to the waiting limousine, Pedro noticed that Heitor and Rita weren't speaking to each other. The tension between them was palpable, filling the small space with an uncomfortable silence. The drive to the gala venue was equally quiet. Pedro stared out the window at the city lights, wondering what his mother would think of him now, dressed like a little businessman, heading to an event where people would donate more money in one night than she had earned in her entire life. When they arrived, the red carpet was lined with photographers and reporters. Rita plastered on her practiced smile, taking Heitor's arm. "Remember, we're one big happy family tonight," she instructed through gritted teeth. Pedro trailed behind them, overwhelmed by the flashing cameras and shouted questions. Someone thrust a microphone toward him. "Pedro, how does it feel to suddenly be the heir to the Albuquerque fortune?" Before he could respond, another reporter called out, Is it true your mother kept you a secret from Heitor all these years? The lies being spread about his mother ignited Pedro's anger. That's not true. My mom... Heitor's hand clamped firmly on his shoulder, cutting him off. No questions about my son tonight, he told the press firmly. This event is about the Foundation's work, not our private life. He guided Pedro inside, away from the cameras. In a quiet corner of the elaborate ballroom, Heitor knelt down to Pedro's level. I know this is difficult, he said, looking his son in the eyes. But these people, they don't care about the truth. They just want a headline. They're saying, bad things about Mom, Pedro replied, his voice thick with emotion. She never kept me a secret. She told me you knew about me, that you just didn't want us. Heitor's expression crumpled. Pedro, that's not... He stopped, seeming to struggle with what to say next. There are things you don't understand yet. Then, explain them to me, Pedro demanded. Before Heitor could respond, Carlos approached, accompanied by Victor Santiago and Gabriela. There's the happy family, Carlos said, his smile not reaching his eyes. Mr. Santiago was just asking about you, Pedro. The elderly businessman regarded Pedro with cold curiosity, as if examining an unusual specimen. So this is the boy who has thrown our merger into question. Pedro met his gaze defiantly. He might be just a kid, but he wasn't going to let this old man intimidate him. Gabriela stepped forward quickly. Pedro, I'm glad you could come tonight. There's a table with some amazing desserts near the terrace. Would you like to see? Grateful for the escape, Pedro nodded. As Gabriela led him away, he heard Santiago say to Heitor, We need to talk, now. On the terrace, away from the noise and glitter of the gala, Pedro took a deep breath of the night. Thanks for rescuing me, Gabriela smiled. I remember how overwhelming these events were when I was your age. She handed him a plate with a slice of chocolate cake. Dessert always helps. Pedro took the cake but didn't eat it. Everyone here is talking about me. I can feel them staring. People will always talk, Gabriela said with a shrug. The trick is not to care what they think. Is that what you do? Pedro asked. A shadow crossed Gabriela's face. I try. It's not always easy when your father is Victor Santiago. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, looking out at the city lights. Your dad found out something today, Gabriela said eventually. Something that upset him a lot. Pedro looked at her sharply. What? Gabriela hesitated. It's not my place to tell you, but I think you should try to talk to him. Really talk to him. There's more to this story than you know. Before Pedro could ask what she meant, the terrace doors burst open. Rita stormed out, her face flushed with anger despite her perfect makeup. There. You are, she snapped at Pedro. Everyone is looking for you. The photographer needs family photos for the society pages. I'm not really family though, am I? Pedro replied coldly. Just a problem you're trying to manage. Rita's composure slipped. Listen to me, you ungrateful little... Careful, Rita, Gabriela interrupted, her voice deceptively calm. Remember where we are. Rita seemed to notice Gabriela for the first time. Her eyes narrowed. Isn't it interesting how often you seem to be around my fiancé's son, Gabriela? One might almost think you had an agenda. Gabriela didn't flinch under Rita's accusation. Unlike some people, my interest in Pedro's well-being isn't motivated by what I can get out of it. The implication was clear, and Rita's face hardened. Pedro, come inside now. Your father is waiting. Go on, Gabriela encouraged him quietly. Remember what I said. When Pedro re-entered the ballroom, he found it buzzing with excitement. A group had gathered around Heitor, who was shaking hands with Santiago. Photographers captured the moment from every angle. Carlos spotted Pedro and waved him over urgently. Come here, nephew, it's happening. The merger is going forward. Pedro reluctantly joined the group. Heitor put an arm around his shoulders, but something felt off. His father's smile didn't reach his eyes, and there was a tension in his body that Pedro could feel through the expensive suit fabric. Santiago. Industries and Albuquerque Group are proud to announce our historic merger, Heitor declared for the benefit of the press. Together, we will create the largest conglomerate in the country's history. Applause erupted around them. Santiago raised his champagne glass. To new beginnings and strong family legacies. Everyone drank to the toast, But Pedro noticed Heitor barely touched his champagne. Something was wrong. Later, as the party continued around them, Pedro found a moment to approach his father alone. "What did you find out today?" he asked directly. "Gabriela said you learned something that upset you." Heitor looked startled by the question. He glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then led Pedro to a quiet alcove away from the crowd. "Your mother tried to contact me," Heitor said, his voice raw with emotion. "When she got sick, she wanted me to know, wanted me to be there for you, but the messages never reached me." Pedro felt a surge of anger. "Why should I believe that? You're just trying to make yourself feel better." "It's the truth," Heitor insisted. "Carlos intercepted her calls, her letters. He thought he was protecting our business, but he was really just helping me hide from my biggest mistake, leaving you and your mother." Pedro stared at his father, trying to process this new information. If what Heitor was saying was true, his mother had died believing his father didn't care enough to even respond. "So what now?" Pedro asked, his voice small. "You signed the merger. You got what you wanted." Heitor looked out at the glittering crowd, the wealthy, the powerful, the people. He had spent his adult life trying to impress. Then he looked back at his son. "What I want," Heitor said slowly, as if just realizing it himself, "is to be the father you deserve. The man your mother believed I could be." For the first time since they had been reunited, Pedro saw something genuine in his father's eyes, regret, pain, and a desperate hope for redemption. Before he could respond, an expectant hush fell over the ballroom. All eyes turned to the main stage, where Carlos stood at the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special announcement tonight," Carlos declared, raising his glass. "My brother, Heitor Albuquerque, and his beautiful fiancée, Rita Garcia, have set a date for their wedding. 1 month from today, we will witness the reunion of two of our city's most prominent families." The crowd erupted in applause and congratulations. Rita beamed at the attention, making her way to the stage to join Carlos. Pedro looked at his father in confusion. "You didn't know about this, did you?" Heitor's expression had turned to stone. "No," he said quietly. "I didn't." As Rita beckoned Heitor to join her on stage, Pedro felt a chill. The pieces were starting to come together. Carlos's manipulation, Rita's ambition, the merger. That seemed more important than people's lives. "What are you going to do?" Pedro asked. Heitor straightened his tie, his jaw set in determination. "Something I should have done a long time ago." He looked at Pedro, his expression softening. "Will you stand with me?" After a moment's hesitation, Pedro nodded. Whatever happened next, he wanted to see it. Together, father and son walked toward the stage, toward a moment that would change the course of the Albuquerque legacy forever. A hush fell over the ballroom as Heitor stepped onto the stage. The crowd expected a smiling groom-to-be, eager to share the joy of his upcoming wedding. Instead, they saw a man whose expression spoke of determination and barely contained anger. Pedro followed a few steps behind, watching his father with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Rita's smile faltered when she saw Heitor's face. She reached for his hand, but he moved past her to the microphone. "Thank you all for coming tonight," Heitor began, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "The Albuquerque Foundation has always stood for family values and integrity. It's in that spirit that I need to set the record straight." An uncomfortable murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not the script they had expected. First, regarding the merger with Santiago Industries, it will not be moving forward as announced. Gasps filled the room. Victor Santiago's face reddened with anger, while Carlos stepped forward trying to intervene. Heitor held up a hand to stop him. Second, regarding the wedding announcement, Heitor turned to face Rita directly. "There will be no wedding." The crowd erupted in shocked whispers. Rita's perfect composure cracked completely, her face contorting with fury and humiliation. "What are you doing?" she hissed, grabbing Heitor's arm. He gently but firmly removed her hand. "What I should have done from the beginning, telling the truth." Carlos pushed his way to the microphone. "My brother is obviously overwhelmed by recent events," he said smoothly, trying to salvage the situation. "If we could all give the family some privacy." No more privacy, Heitor interrupted, taking back the microphone. No more secrets. That's what got us here in the first place. He looked out at the stunned faces of the city's elite. 8 years ago, I made a choice to pursue wealth and power over the people who mattered most. The mother of my child and my son. It was the worst mistake of my life, one I've been paying for ever since without even knowing it. Pedro stared at his father in disbelief. He had never expected such a public confession. I recently discovered that my son's mother tried to contact me when she became ill, Heitor continued, his voice cracking slightly. She wanted me to be there for our son, but those messages were deliberately kept from me. All eyes turned to Carlos, whose face had gone pale. I've spent years building an empire at the cost of what really matters, Heitor said. But that ends tonight. The Albuquerque group will continue, but with a new mission and new leadership. He gestured for Pedro to join him at the microphone. Reluctantly, the boy stepped forward. This is my son, Pedro. Not an inconvenience, not a PR problem, but the most important person in my life. From now on, everything I do will be with his future in mind. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. No one had ever seen Heitor Albuquerque speak with such raw emotion. Rita recovered first, her eyes cold with fury. "You'll regret this," she said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "You have no idea what you're throwing away." "Actually, I know exactly what I'm throwing away," Heitor replied calmly, "and I know what I'm gaining." With that, he put his arm around Pedro's shoulders and walked off the stage. The crowd parted before them, too shocked to even whisper. As they neared the exit, Gabriela stepped forward, a smile of admiration on her face. Behind her, Victor Santiago watched with calculating eyes, already reassessing the situation. Carlos caught up with them at the door, his face twisted with rage. "You've destroyed everything we built," he spat. "For what? Some kid you barely know?" "No," Heitor replied evenly. "For the man I want to be." He looked his brother in the eye. "You kept Maria's messages from me. You let her die alone. You let my son grow up thinking I didn't care. I'll never forgive you for that." Carlos flinched at the cold finality in his brother's voice. "This isn't over," he warned. "Yes, it is," Heitor replied. "As of tomorrow, you're no longer part of Albuquerque Group. The board will receive my full report on your actions first thing in the morning." He turned away from his brother for the last time, guiding Pedro toward the exit. As they stepped outside, away from the glare and spectacle, Heitor took a deep breath of the night air. "I'm sorry you had to see all that," he told Pedro, "but I wanted you to know where I stand." Pedro looked up at his father, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. "Did you mean what you said in there? About me being the most important person in your life?" Heitor knelt down so they were eye to eye. "Every word. I can't change the past, Pedro. I can't bring your mother back or erase the years I missed. But if you'll let me, I want to be your father, really be your father from now on." For a long moment, Pedro said nothing. Then, slowly, he extended his hand. It wasn't quite an embrace, but it was a beginning. "I'd like to go home now," Pedro said quietly. Heitor nodded, understanding that home was still a concept they would need to define together. In the days that followed, the scandal of the Albuquerque Charity Gala dominated headlines. Paparazzi camped outside the penthouse, hoping to catch a glimpse of the billionaire and his newfound son. The business world buzzed with speculation about the future of Albuquerque Group without the Santiago merger and with Carlos forced out. But inside the penthouse, a different kind of story was unfolding, a quieter one about a father and son learning to know each other. One morning, as they sat having breakfast, Heitor noticed Pedro pushing his food around his plate, lost in thought. "What's on your mind?" Heitor asked. Pedro looked up, hesitating. "I was thinking about Mom," he finally admitted. "About her apartment. All our stuff is gone now." Heitor put down his coffee cup. "Not all of it," he said. He stood, gesturing for Pedro to follow him to his home office. Inside, Heitor unlocked a cabinet and removed a box. "After you told me about your mother, I sent someone to the apartment building. The new tenants had found this in a closet and were going to throw it away." He handed the box to Pedro, who opened it with trembling hands. Inside were photo albums, a few books with Maria's notes in the margins, and a small jewelry box containing her wedding ring. the one Hator had given her in another lifetime. She kept these, Pedro whispered, tears filling his eyes. She never stopped loving you, Hator said gently, and I think, in her way, she never stopped loving me either, despite everything. Pedro clutched the photo album to his chest. I miss her so much. I know, Hator said, putting an arm around his son's shoulders. I miss her too, the person I was when I was with her. They sat together, looking through the albums, Hator listening as Pedro shared stories about his mother, her laugh, her love of poetry, the way she'd sing in the kitchen while cooking. Later that afternoon, Laura arrived for Pedro's study session. She had been a constant presence in their lives since the gala, a steady support during the chaos that followed Hator's public declarations. How are my two favorite men? She asked, setting down her bag of books. Better, Hator replied with a glance at Pedro. We're working on it. Laura smiled, understanding the progress those simple words represented. I brought Pedro's registration forms for school, she said, handing Hator a folder. Classes start in 3 weeks. As Pedro and Laura settled at the dining room table with their books, Hator retreated to his office to handle the mountain of work that had accumulated. The restructuring of Albuquerque Group was underway, with Carlos fighting the changes every step of the way. The board was divided, with some members resigning in protest and others rallying. Behind Hator's new vision for the company, a knock on his office door interrupted his thoughts. Donna Celeste entered with a cup of coffee and an unexpected visitor, Gabriela Santiago. Mrs. Santiago is here to see you, Donna Celeste announced, with a knowing smile. Gabriela looked different outside the corporate setting, more relaxed in jeans and a simple blouse. I hope I'm not interrupting, she said. Not at all, Hator replied, genuinely pleased to see her. How are things with your father? Gabriela's smile faltered slightly. Tense, he's not used to being turned down, especially so publicly, but he'll survive. His ego is remarkably resilient. And what about you? Hator asked. I imagine I'm not the only one facing family disapproval these days, Gabriela laughed. Let's just say I'm no longer being groomed as the future leader of Santiago Industries. My father doesn't appreciate my disloyalty in siding with you. Hator frowned. I never meant to come between you and your father. You didn't, Gabriela assured him. This has been coming for a long time. I've never shared my father's vision for the company, or his methods. She hesitated. Actually, that's partly why I'm here. I have a proposal for you. Before she could elaborate, Pedro appeared in the doorway. His face lit up when he saw Gabriela. You're here, he exclaimed. Laura and I are about to play a board game. Want to join us? Gabriela looked between Pedro and Hator, clearly torn. Go ahead, Hator encouraged her. Business can wait. Board games with my son can't. As Gabriela followed Pedro to the living room, Hator found himself watching them with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. Somehow, this boy who had crashed into his life barely 2 weeks ago had already changed everything. The penthouse, once a showcase of his wealth and success, was becoming a home. 3 months later, the Albuquerque penthouse was filled with the sounds of conversation and laughter. It was Pedro's 14th birthday, and the first real celebration he'd had since his mother's death. The guest list was small but meaningful. Laura, who had become like family. Gabriela, who now worked with Hator as the new chief operating officer of Albuquerque Group, Donna Celeste and her husband, and a few of Pedro's classmates from his new school. The transformation in Pedro was remarkable. The angry, guarded boy who had burst into the Grand Royal Hotel was now laughing as he opened presents, comfortable in his skin and in his place in Hator's life. Hator stood back, watching the scene with quiet joy. Laura approached, handing him a glass of lemonade. You did good, she said, nodding toward Pedro. He's happy. We both are, Hator replied. Over the past months, he and Laura had grown closer, their shared concern for Pedro evolving into something deeper. They were taking it slowly, both aware of the complications their relationship could bring, but neither willing to deny the connection between them. Any word from Carlos? Laura asked. Hator shook his head. After a bitter legal battle, Carlos had left the company with a settlement that ensured he would be financially comfortable, but no longer involved in any Albuquerque enterprise. He had moved abroad, unable to face the social fallout of the gala scandal. And Rita? Still making her presence felt in the society pages, Heiter said with a wry smile. Currently dating a European count, if the gossip is accurate. Laura chuckled. She always lands on her feet. Your mother's care? Heitor asked, knowing it had been a concern for Laura after Rita withdrew her financial support. Secure, Laura confirmed, thanks to you. She squeezed his hand gratefully. Their conversation was interrupted when Pedro called for everyone's attention. He stood in the center of the room, suddenly looking nervous. I want to thank everyone for coming today, he began, his voice steady despite his obvious emotion. This past year has been the hardest of my life. I lost my mom, who was the best person I've ever known. He paused, gathering himself. But I also found my dad, which is something I never thought would happen. Heiter felt his throat tighten with emotion. My mom used to tell me that families aren't just about blood. They're about who stands by you when things get tough, Pedro continued. So thank you all for being my family, in all the ways that matter. The room erupted in applause, and Heiter moved forward to embrace his son. Your mother would be so proud of you, he whispered. Later, as the party wound down, Heitor found Pedro on the balcony, looking out at the sunset. He joined his son, both of them leaning on the railing. Good birthday, Heitor asked. Pedro nodded. The best. He hesitated, then reached into his pocket. I've been wanting to give you something. He handed Heitor a small, worn photograph. It showed Maria holding a newborn Pedro, her face glowing with love and exhaustion. Mom kept this by her bed, Pedro explained. She said it was taken the day after I was born. She said you took the picture. Heitor stared at the image, memories flooding back. He had been so young then, so in love, so full of dreams that had nothing to do with wealth or power. I remember, he said softly. It was the happiest day of my life, though I didn't realize it at the time. You can keep it, Pedro said. I have others. Heitor carefully tucked the photo into his wallet, next to a newer one of Pedro on his first day at his new school. Thank you. This means more than you know. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the city lights come on as darkness fell. Dad, Pedro said, the word still new but feeling more natural each time he used it. Do you ever regret it, giving up the merger and everything? Heiter considered the question, thinking about the past months of restructuring the company, of fighting the board, of rebuilding his life around his son. Not for a second, he replied honestly. Some things look valuable until you realize what they cost you, and some things seem simple until you realize they're worth more than everything else combined. Pedro nodded, understanding even at his young age. Like family. Exactly like family, Heitor agreed, putting an arm around his son's shoulders. Inside the penthouse, Gabriela was helping Donna Celeste clean up, while Laura chatted with the last few lingering guests. They had all, in their own ways, helped bridge the gap between father and son, helped heal wounds that had seemed unhealable. As if sensing his thoughts, Pedro said, Laura's pretty great, isn't she? Heitor smiled. Yes, she is. And Gabriela, too, Pedro added with the hint of a blush. Very perceptive, son, Heitor chuckled. It seems the Albuquerque men have good taste in women. At the luxurious Grand Royal Hotel, Heitor Albuquerque celebrated another triumph, until a scream shattered the night. Dad, you forgot me. A boy in tattered clothes stood before him, unveiling buried secrets and challenging everything Heitor had built. Will his empire survive the truth? Before we begin, comment below where in the world you're watching from. Pedro turned serious. I think Mom would like them both. She always said people deserve second chances. Heitor felt the weight of those words, the gift of forgiveness from a woman who had every right to be bitter, passed down through the son who had every reason to reject him. Your mother was the wisest person I've ever known, Heitor said. And I see so much of her in you. From inside, Laura called that it was time for the birthday cake. Pedro turned to go, then paused, looking back at his father. Coming, Dad? Heitor smiled. feeling a contentment he had never found in all his years of chasing success. "Right behind you, son." As they rejoined the others, Heitor thought about the journey that had brought them here, from the angry confrontation at the Grand Royal Hotel to this moment of genuine family happiness. The road ahead would have its challenges, but for the first time in 8 years he was walking the right path. The abandoned son had found his father, and the lost father had found his way home. 2 years later, a small group gathered in the garden of a countryside chapel. White flowers lined the aisle, but there was no elaborate decoration, no press, no society photographers, just family and close friends. Pedro, now 16 and nearly as tall as his father, straightened Heitor's tie. "Nervous?" he asked with a grin. "Terrified," Heitor admitted, smoothing his suit jacket for the 10th time. "She already said yes," Pedro reminded him. "That's the hard part." Heitor laughed, marveling at his son's wisdom. "When did you get so smart about relationships?" Pedro shrugged, a slight blush coloring his cheeks. "Gabriella's been giving me advice." The mention of Gabriella brought a knowing smile to Heitor's face. His son's crush on the former Santiago heiress had evolved into a close friendship that showed signs of perhaps becoming something more as Pedro grew older. Gabriella, now a full partner in the restructured Albuquerque group, had become an integral part of their lives. The music started, signaling it was time. Heitor took his place under the simple floral arch, with Pedro standing proudly beside him as best man. The small gathering of guests stood as Laura appeared at the end of the aisle, beautiful in a simple white dress, her sister Rita conspicuously absent from the celebration. As Laura walked toward him, Heitor felt a sense of coming full circle. His journey had taken him from a simple life with Maria, through years of wealth and emptiness, to this new beginning, a family built on honesty and forgiveness. Pedro watched his father's face, seeing the love there, and felt a deep contentment. He missed his mother every day, but he knew she would be happy for them. From his pocket he touched the small locket containing her picture, a reminder that she was still with him, still part of this new family they had created. As Heitor and Laura exchanged their vows, Pedro thought about the night he had stormed into the Grand Royal Hotel, desperate and alone. He had been looking for answers, for someone to blame, for a place to belong. He had found all that and more. He had found his father, not the billionaire businessman, but the man his mother had loved, the man who had finally remembered what truly mattered. After the ceremony, as guests mingled in the garden, Heitor found a moment alone with his son. "Happy?" Pedro asked. Heitor looked at Laura, laughing with Donna Celeste near the cake, at Gabriella, who had risked her own family relationships to stand by them. At the simple but meaningful celebration, so different from the extravagant life he had once pursued. "Completely," Heitor replied. "You know, when you came looking for me that night, you said I abandoned you for money." Pedro winced at the memory. "I was angry." "You were right," Heitor said. "But you also saved me, son. You reminded me of who I really am." Pedro smiled. No longer the forgotten son, but the heart of a family that had been lost and found again. As Laura called them over for photographs, father and son walked together across the garden, their shadows merging in the afternoon sun. Two lives once separated by ambition and regret, now united by something far more valuable than any fortune. The end.